Imagine a prison cell. What do you see? For most, the image is one of cold steel, gray concrete, and the oppressive clang of a barred door. It's a space of deprivation, of punishment, of time being brutally served. Now, imagine a different room. This one has a comfortable bed, a private bathroom, a mini fridge, and a large, unbarred window that looks out not onto a concrete yard, but onto a tranquil forest of birch and pine trees. This isn't a university dorm or a budget hotel. This is also a prison cell. The first exists by the hundreds of thousands across the United States, the heart of a system of mass incarceration unprecedented in human history. The second can be found in Norway, a nation that has fundamentally redefined the purpose of imprisonment. This is not just a story of two different types of cells. It's a story of two profoundly different philosophies of justice, crime, and human potential. A tale of two worlds separated by an ocean, but more so by a chasm in ideology, with consequences that ripple through the lives of millions and define the very character of a nation. To understand America's colossal prison apparatus, one must look back to its origins, which began not with a thirst for punishment, but with a quest for penitence. In 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors in Philadelphia, a Gothic fortress designed by Quakers with a radical new idea. They believed that through solitary confinement, silence, and labor, the criminal could reflect on their sins, become genuinely penitent, and find redemption. This Pennsylvania system was revolutionary, replacing the public floggings and humiliation of the colonial era with a model of isolation intended to reform the soul. It was, in its own way, a humane ideal born of the Enlightenment, a belief that the individual could be reshaped. But this ideal was difficult to maintain. The profound psychological damage of total isolation became apparent. And as the nation grew and industrialized, the focus shifted from individual redemption to societal control. For over a century, the American prison system expanded, but its core purpose remained a shifting, often contradictory mix of punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The incarceration rate, while growing, remained relatively stable for much of the 20th century. It was a problem, but not yet a crisis. That all changed in the 1970s. A perfect storm of rising crime rates, social unrest, and political opportunism gave birth to a new era, the tough-on-crime movement. The narrative shifted decisively. Criminals were no longer seen as misguided souls in need of reform, but as irredeemable predators from whom society must be protected at all costs. President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971, a turn of phrase that would have catastrophic consequences, framing addiction as a criminal failure rather than a public health issue. This war was escalated dramatically in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. The passage of harsh anti-drug abuse acts introduced mandatory minimum sentences, which stripped judges of their discretion and imposed draconian penalties for even low-level drug offenses. The disparity in sentencing between crack cocaine, more prevalent in black communities, and powder cocaine, more common among whites, was particularly egregious. A 100-to-1 ratio that funneled hundreds of thousands of African American men into the prison system. This punitive fervor swept across the country. States enacted 3 strikes laws, mandating life sentences for a third felony conviction regardless of its severity. Truth in sentencing laws were passed, requiring offenders to serve a substantial portion of their sentence, often 85% or more, before being eligible for parole. The system was no longer about nuance or individual circumstances. It was a machine designed for one purpose: incapacitation. The numbers tell a staggering story. Between 1970 and 2008, the United States prison population exploded by over 700%, from roughly 357,000 to more than 2.3 million people. A nation that represents less than 5% of the world's population suddenly found itself holding nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. This wasn't a gradual increase. It was a policy-driven vertical climb that created an archipelago of prisons across the American landscape, a system of mass incarceration on a scale the world had never seen. The philosophy of penitence was dead. In its place stood a new model, one that ironically returned to a form of isolation not for redemption but for control. The Supermax prison, exemplified by facilities like ADX Florence in Colorado, which opened in 1994, became the ultimate expression of this new punitive age. Here, inmates are held in 23-hour-a-day lockdown in concrete cells where the bed, desk, and stool are all molded from a single slab of concrete. Human contact is virtually non-existent. It is the Quaker ideal of isolation twisted into a tool of pure, unadulterated punishment. This new system was not built by accident. It was a series of deliberate political choices, fueled by fear and broadcast on the evening news. It was the product of a society that had decided the best way to deal with its social problems was to lock them away and throw away the key. The consequences of these choices would prove to be as devastating as they were predictable. The sheer scale of this carceral expansion created a system under constant, crushing pressure. The architecture of the American prison became one of efficiency and control, not rehabilitation. Long, sterile corridors, vast cell blocks housing hundreds of men in stacked bunks, and communal day rooms ruled by tension and the constant threat of violence became the norm. Facilities designed for 1,000 inmates were soon housing 2,000 or more. Gymnasiums and classrooms were converted into makeshift dormitories filled with rows of triple bunks. The air grows thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, industrial disinfectant, and despair. The noise is a constant, low-grade roar, a cacophony of shouts, clanging steel, and blaring televisions that never ceases, grinding down the senses and making sleep a precious, fleeting commodity. In this environment, the very concept of rehabilitation becomes a cruel joke. Educational programs, vocational training, and mental health services, the very tools that might equip an individual to succeed on the outside, are the first things to be cut when budgets are strained. A single counselor might be responsible for hundreds of inmates, an impossible caseload that reduces therapy to little more than crisis management. Correctional officers, too, are placed in an untenable position. Outnumbered and often undertrained, their primary role shifts from guidance to crowd control. They are taught to be constantly vigilant, to see every inmate as a potential threat. This fosters a culture of mutual distrust and antagonism, where any sign of humanity can be interpreted as a weakness to be exploited. The relationship is not one of mentor and mentee, but of guard and guarded. The physical environment itself becomes an instrument of punishment. Food is often a tasteless, high-starch, low-nutrition slurry, engineered for mass production and minimal cost. Access to fresh air and sunlight is limited to a few hours a week in a concrete yard, often called the cage, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The view is not of a forest, but of a guard tower. This is not an exaggeration. It is the documented reality in many American correctional facilities. The system is designed to break the human spirit, to strip away identity and autonomy. Upon entry, an individual is stripped of their name and given a number. They are stripped of their clothes and given a uniform. They are stripped of their freedom of movement, their freedom of choice, and ultimately their sense of self-worth. Consider the notorious Attica Correctional Facility in New York. Its name is synonymous with the brutal realities of the American prison. The 1971 Attica Uprising, where inmates seized control of the prison to protest inhumane conditions, ended in a bloody siege that left 43 people dead. The prisoners' demands were simple: better food, adequate medical care, and access to meaningful educational programs. Their protest was a desperate cry for dignity in a system designed to deny it. Decades later, many of these same issues persist. In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark ruling in the case of Brown versus Plata. The court found that the overcrowding in California's prisons was so severe that it constituted a violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The system was failing to provide even the most basic medical and mental health care, leading to preventable deaths. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority, described a system in which suicidal inmates were held in telephone booth-sized cages without toilets, and a prison population so dense that it created a breeding ground for disease. The ruling forced California to reduce its prison population, but it also served as a damning indictment of a system that had grown so large and so unwieldy that it had become fundamentally unconstitutional. The consequences of this environment are predictable. Trapped in a world of constant stress, deprivation, and violence, inmates adapt. They learn to be hard, to be suspicious, to show no weakness. They form allegiances with gangs for protection. The social skills needed to function in the outside world, cooperation, empathy, conflict resolution, atrophy and are replaced by the skills needed to survive inside, intimidation, manipulation, and violence. The American prison, in many cases, does not rehabilitate. It is a finishing school for criminality. This is the reality of the machine built by the tough-on-crime era. It is a system that consumes billions of dollars and millions of lives. A sprawling monument to a philosophy of punishment that has failed by almost every conceivable metric, most notably in its stated goal of making society safer. The most insidious legacy of the war on drugs and the era of mass incarceration is its profoundly disproportionate impact on communities of color. In her seminal 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, legal scholar Michelle Alexander argued that the U.S. criminal justice system has functioned as a contemporary system of racial control, creating a new racial caste system in an era when overt discrimination is no longer legally permissible. The statistics are stark and undeniable. While making up only about 13% of the U.S. population, Black individuals constitute approximately 33% of the incarcerated population. 1 in 3 Black men born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime, compared to 1 in 17 white men. This is not because of a higher propensity for crime, but because of a system that has targeted them at every stage. It begins on the streets, with policing strategies that concentrate on minority neighborhoods, leading to higher rates of stops, frisks, and arrests for the same behaviors that go unpunished in white communities. It continues in the courtroom, where racial bias, both implicit and explicit, can influence prosecutorial decisions, jury selections, and sentencing outcomes. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, which was only partially addressed by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, is a textbook example of a policy that, on its face, was race-neutral, but in its application was devastatingly discriminatory. Once an individual is branded a felon, they are relegated to a permanent second-class status. They can be legally denied employment, housing, and access to public benefits. In many states, they lose the right to vote, sometimes permanently. This creates a web of legal and social barriers that makes successful re-entry into society nearly impossible. This system doesn't just punish the individual, it destabilizes entire communities. It removes fathers and mothers, workers and leaders from their families and neighborhoods. It creates a cycle of poverty and incarceration that is passed down through generations. Children who grow up with an incarcerated parent are more likely to suffer from emotional and behavioral problems and are themselves at a higher risk of future involvement with the justice system. The war on drugs, sold to the public as a campaign for public safety, became in practice a war on specific communities. It prioritized punishment over treatment, filling prisons with non-violent drug offenders who needed medical care, not a prison cell. This policy choice not only failed to solve the problem of drug addiction, but also created a host of new, more intractable social problems. The system, as Michelle Alexander argues, has created a vast undercast of citizens who are locked out of the mainstream economy and society. It is a system of control that operates not through overt segregation, but through the seemingly neutral machinery of criminal justice. It is the grim, logical endpoint of a philosophy that chooses punishment over investment and control over compassion. The ultimate measure of a correctional system's success is not how effectively it punishes, but how effectively it prevents future crime. By this metric, the American system is a catastrophic failure. The term for reoffending after release is recidivism, and in the United States, the rates are appallingly high. A landmark study by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics tracked prisoners released from 30 states in 2005. The findings were sobering. Within 3 years of release, about 2/3, 68%, of prisoners were arrested for a new crime. Within 5 years, that number climbed to 77%. The system is not a place of correction. It is a revolving door. Individuals are released from prison, often with little more than a bus ticket and a few dollars in their pocket. They carry the stigma of a criminal record, which makes finding a job or a place to live extraordinarily difficult. They return to the same communities they left, often with no new skills and a host of new traumas. They are disconnected from their families and social support networks. Lacking viable, legal pathways to stability, it is little wonder that so many fall back into the patterns of behavior that led them to prison in the first place. This cycle is not only a human tragedy, it is also a massive drain on public resources. Each time an individual reoffends, it creates a new victim and incurs new costs for law enforcement, the courts, and ultimately for reincarceration. The United States spends tens of billions of dollars each year to maintain this cycle of failure, locking up the same people over and over again. The high rate of recidivism is the clearest possible evidence that the punitive model does not work. A system built on deprivation, fear, and idleness does not produce law-abiding citizens. It produces individuals who are more damaged, more isolated, and less equipped to function in society than they were before they entered. It is a self-perpetuating crisis, a machine that feeds on its own failures. This is the American reality, a system born from a well-intentioned but flawed ideal of penitence, which morphed into a punitive behemoth during the tough-on-crime era. It is a system defined by its scale, its racial disparities, and its utter failure to rehabilitate. It is a world away from the pine forests of Norway. Across the Atlantic, another story was unfolding. It is a common misconception that Norway's humane prison system is the product of some deep-seated, ancient Scandinavian tradition of gentleness. The reality is far more instructive. Until the late 20th century, Norway's prison system was, like much of the Western world, largely punitive. It was based on a model of retribution and control, and it was failing spectacularly. In the 1980s, recidivism rates in Norway hovered between 60% and 70%, numbers that are eerily similar to those in the United States today. The prisons were harsh, the staff were disengaged, and the results were abysmal. But unlike in the United States, where the response to failure was to double down on punishment, Norway chose a different path. A period of profound soul-searching began. This was not a sudden epiphany, but a gradual evolution driven by a growing dissatisfaction with the status quo. Activist groups like the Norwegian Association for Criminal Reform, CRUM, founded in 1968, began to challenge the fundamental assumptions of the correctional system. They argued for a more humane approach, one that respected the rights of the incarcerated. Early reforms, like the abolition of forced labor in 1970, signaled a changing tide. The turning point came in the early 1990s. Spurred by a series of damning reports and a growing political consensus, the Norwegian Ministry of Justice undertook a complete overhaul of its correctional philosophy. The core realization was simple but revolutionary. The punitive approach was a costly failure. It didn't make society safer. It just created a cycle of crime and punishment. Two key principles emerged that would become the bedrock of the new Norwegian model: restorative justice and normalization. Restorative justice focuses on repairing the harm caused by crime, rather than simply punishing the offender. It emphasizes accountability, dialogue, and reintegration. The goal is not to inflict pain, but to heal wounds for the victim, the community, and the offender. The principle of normalization is even more radical. It holds that life inside prison should resemble life outside as closely as possible. The only punishment an inmate should suffer is the deprivation of their liberty. All other rights, the right to education, to health care, to vote, to be treated with dignity, remain intact. The primary goal of the prison sentence is to prepare the individual for a successful, crime-free life upon release. This was not just a change in rhetoric, it was a fundamental shift in the entire purpose of incarceration. The system was reoriented away from warehousing bodies and toward rebuilding lives. The government invested heavily in new facilities, in extensive staff training, and in evidence-based rehabilitation programs. The result was a system that looks, feels, and functions unlike any other in the world. Nowhere is this new philosophy more evident than at Halden Prison, which opened in 2010. Often called the world's most humane prison, Halden was designed from the ground up to embody the principle of normalization. The architects, Eric Muller and HLM Architecture, were explicitly tasked with creating a facility that minimized the institutional feel and maximized a sense of humanity. The prison is spread out over a 75-acre campus, nestled within a natural forest. There are no imposing walls, but rather a single, tall security fence that is designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. The buildings are clad in natural wood and stone, blending into the landscape. The design is deliberately anti-authoritarian. Inside, the cells are private rooms, which Norwegians call rom, the word for room, not cell. Each has an ensuite bathroom with a shower, a small refrigerator, a desk, and that famous unbarred window. The windows are made of reinforced glass, but the lack of bars is a powerful symbolic statement. You are a person, not an animal in a cage. Inmates are not confined to their rooms all day. They are expected to be out, participating in work, education, or other programs. The prison features amenities that would be unthinkable in an American facility: a fully equipped music recording studio, a modern gymnasium with a rock climbing wall, a library, and a communal kitchen and living room for every 10-12 cells, where inmates can buy groceries from the prison store and cook their own meals. These amenities are not luxuries, they are tools of rehabilitation. The music studio provides a constructive outlet for emotional expression and teaches valuable technical skills. The communal kitchens foster social skills, cooperation, and responsibility. The entire environment is designed to simulate the challenges and choices of life in a normal community. The most critical element of the Halden model, however, is not its architecture, but its staff. Norwegian prison officers undergo a rigorous 2-year training program at the university level, which includes studies in law, ethics, psychology, and social work. They are not trained as guards, but as role models, coaches, and mentors. This approach is called dynamic security. Unlike the static security of walls, cameras, and fences, dynamic security is based on building positive, professional relationships between staff and inmates. The officers are unarmed. They eat meals with the inmates, play sports with them, and engage in conversation. This constant interaction builds trust and reduces tension, creating an environment where problems can be de-escalated through dialogue rather than force. Høydahl, the former governor of Halden, famously encapsulated the philosophy when he said, "In Norway, the punishment is just to take away someone's liberty. The other rights stay. They don't lose their rights to vote, to education, to health service. They are still a human being." This simple statement lies at the heart of the divide between the Norwegian and American systems.
It is a belief in the enduring humanity of every individual, regardless of the crime they have committed.
If Halden is the model of a humane, high-security prison, then Bastoy prison represents the Norwegian philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. Located on a small island in the Oslo Fjord, Bastoy is a minimum security facility that operates more like a small, self-sustaining village than a prison. There are no cells at Bastoy. The approximately 100 inmates live in shared wooden cottages, each housing about 6 men. They are responsible for their own cooking and cleaning. The island has a farm with livestock, a forestry operation, a small shop, a library, and even a public beach. Inmates run the island's ferry service to the mainland.
The work is not meaningless toil. It is an integral part of the island's ecosystem. Inmates learn skills in agriculture, mechanics, and carpentry. They are given real responsibilities and are trusted to carry them out. The focus is on creating what the prison staff call good neighbors.
Arne Kvernvik Nilsen, a psychologist and the celebrated former governor of Bastoy, articulated this idea with profound clarity. In the closed prisons, we keep them in for some time and then let them out. We don't do much for them. We are releasing neighbors. If we treat them like animals in prison, then we will release animals. This philosophy is a direct rebuke to the logic of punitive incarceration. It posits that the best way to ensure public safety is not to brutalize offenders, but to treat them with dignity and equip them with the skills and sense of responsibility needed to become productive members of society upon release. At Bastoy, this is not an abstract theory, it is a lived reality. The history of the island itself is a powerful metaphor for Norway's transformation. From 1900 to 1953, Bastoy was home to a brutal state-run reform school for maladjusted boys. Conditions were horrific, and in 1915, the boys staged a violent uprising that had to be quelled by the Norwegian military. The island was a place of trauma and abuse. Its transformation into a pioneering ecological prison in the 1980s was a deliberate act of redemption, an attempt to turn a site of past cruelty into a beacon of future hope. Today, the recidivism rate for inmates who have passed through Bastoy is reported to be as low as 16%, a stunning testament to the effectiveness of its approach. The trust placed in the inmates at Bastoy is remarkable. It is a minimum security facility, and escapes, while possible, are rare. The inmates know that a place at Bastoy is a privilege, a final step on the path back to society, and they are invested in the system's success. It is a system built not on coercion, but on a compact of mutual respect and responsibility. The principles of dynamic security and normalization are not confined to specific showcase prisons. They are woven into the fabric of the entire Norwegian correctional service. The system operates on a progression model. Most offenders start their sentences in a closed, high-security prison like Halden, and as they demonstrate progress and responsibility, they can earn the right to transfer to a lower-security facility like Bastoy and eventually to a halfway house before their final release. This progression creates a powerful incentive for good behavior and active participation in rehabilitation programs. It provides a clear, tangible path back to freedom, giving inmates a sense of hope and agency over their own futures, a stark contrast to the sense of powerlessness that pervades many American prisons. Education is a cornerstone of the Norwegian system. Every inmate has the right and often the obligation to pursue education, from basic literacy to university-level courses. The prison libraries are well-stocked and classrooms are equipped with modern technology. The goal is to ensure that an individual leaves prison more educated and more employable than when they entered. Similarly, healthcare, and particularly mental health care, is a priority. Psychologists and social workers are an integral part of the prison staff. They work with inmates to address the underlying issues that may have contributed to their criminal behavior, such as trauma, addiction, or mental illness.
The focus is on healing, not just containment.
The Norwegian system is not perfect. It faces its egne challenges med gangaktivitet og budsjettkonstrenter. Og det deals med et mye smålere og mer homogen populasjon enn the United States. Kritikere samtids argumentet at slik en modell kunne never verke i et land som lart og diverst som Amerika. Men det norwegiske offisielle kvikt til å pointe ut at deres system var ikke born i en pedelig utopia. Det var forgd i respons til det feil av den samme punitive modell da Amerika still klings til.
They didn't change their system because they were soft on crime. They changed it because they were smart on crime. They recognized that the old way was not working, and they had the political courage and the social will to try something radically different.
The ultimate validation of Norway's approach lies in the numbers. The investment in humanity has paid off in the currency of public safety. Norway's 2-year recidivism rate is around 20%. The 5-year rate is approximately 25%. These are among the lowest rates in the entire world. Compare this again to the United States, where the 5-year recidivism rate is over 70%. The difference is not a statistical anomaly. It is the direct result of two fundamentally different approaches to corrections. One system invests in preparing individuals for release, while the other creates conditions that make reoffending almost inevitable.
Norway's incarceration rate is also one of the lowest in the developed world, at approximately 59 per 100,000 people as of 2020. The U.S. rate in the same year was 639 per 100,000, more than 10 times higher. Norway achieves a safer society by locking up far fewer people for shorter periods of time and in a far more humane way.
This statistical success challenges the core logic of the tough-on-crime movement, which posits that harsh punishment and long sentences are the most effective deterrents. The Norwegian experience suggests the opposite is true, that a system based on dignity, rehabilitation, and reintegration is ultimately the most effective strategy for reducing crime and ensuring long-term public safety. The data demonstrates that treating prisoners as future members of society rather than as outcasts to be permanently punished is not a matter of liberal idealism. It is a pragmatic, evidence-based approach that yields superior results. The philosophical chasm between the two systems is most apparent in the texture of daily life. Consider a typical day for an inmate in a maximum security prison in the United States. The day begins before dawn with a jarring wake-up call and a head count. Breakfast is a rushed affair in a crowded, noisy mess hall. The day is then filled with long stretches of enforced idleness, punctuated by the constant threat of violence. Meaningful work or educational opportunities are scarce. Human interaction is fraught with tension. The primary relationship with staff is one of command and compliance. The day ends with a lockdown, confined to a small shared cell for the night. It is a life of monotony, fear, and powerlessness. Now, consider a day at a prison like Halden. The day also begins with a wake-up call, but inmates then leave their private rooms to prepare their own breakfast in a communal kitchen. They then go to their jobs or classes, which are designed to be meaningful and skill-building. They might be working in the prison's metal shop, learning to be a mechanic, or studying for a degree. Lunch is eaten with the staff. The afternoon might involve a session in the music studio, a workout in the gym, or a meeting with a psychologist. In the evening, they cook dinner with their unit mates, watch television in the shared living room, and then retire to their own rooms. It is a life structured around responsibility, normalcy, and purpose. This difference extends to the very language used. In the U.S., they are inmates or offenders, watched over by guards. In Norway, they are pupils or residents, guided by officers who act as mentors. The language reflects a fundamental difference in how the person is viewed, as a problem to be managed or as a person to be developed. Even the approach to punishment for infractions within the prison differs. In the U.S., a violation often results in solitary confinement, a punishment that exacerbates psychological distress.
In Norway, the most common punishment is the loss of privileges, such as access to television or a reduction in their weekly allowance. The response is proportional and designed to teach consequences without resorting to dehumanizing practices.
The American system operates on the logic of deprivation. It believes that by making life as unpleasant as possible, it will deter future crime. The Norwegian system operates on the logic of responsibility. It believes that by giving individuals the opportunity to live a normal, productive life within the prison, it will teach them how to do so on the outside. One approach is rooted in fear. The other is rooted in hope.
Critics of the Norwegian model often point to its high cost. Building and operating a prison like Halden, with its high staff-to-inmate ratio and extensive programming, is undeniably expensive on a per-inmate, per-day basis. The initial investment is significant. However, this argument is profoundly short-sighted, as it fails to account for the long-term economic calculus. The American system of mass incarceration is astronomically expensive. The United States spends over $80 billion annually on corrections, but the true cost is much higher. When you factor in the costs of policing and courts and the societal costs of crime and victimization, the figure balloons. The high recidivism rate means that society pays to incarcerate the same individuals again and again, a cripplingly expensive cycle. Furthermore, mass incarceration has hidden economic costs. It removes millions of working-age individuals from the economy, reduces their future earning potential, and places a significant financial burden on their families. It is a drag on economic growth and a driver of intergenerational poverty.
Norway's investment, on the other hand, is front-loaded. By spending more on rehabilitation, education, and staff training, they dramatically reduce the long-term costs associated with recidivism. Every individual who leaves prison and becomes a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen represents a massive net gain for society. They are no longer a drain on public resources. They are a contributor to the public good.
When viewed through this wider economic lens, the Norwegian system is not an expensive luxury. It is a fiscally prudent investment. The American system, with its seemingly cheaper per diem costs in some facilities, is a colossal waste of money, a perpetual motion machine of failure that generates immense social and economic costs for generations to come.
The question that inevitably arises is whether the Norwegian model could ever be implemented in the United States. The challenges are immense. The sheer scale of the U.S. system, with its more than 1.9 million incarcerated individuals, dwarfs Norway's, which holds only a few thousand.
The political and cultural barriers are also formidable. The tough-on-crime narrative is deeply embedded in American political discourse. Any politician who proposes treating prisoners more humanely risks being branded as soft on crime, a potentially career-ending label. There is a strong retributive impulse in American culture, a belief that those who commit serious crimes have forfeited their right to be treated with dignity. Furthermore, the American criminal justice system is highly decentralized, with a complex web of federal, state, and local jurisdictions. Implementing a sweeping, nationwide reform on the scale of Norway's would be a monumental undertaking. The private prison industry also represents a powerful lobby with a vested financial interest in maintaining high incarceration rates. Yet, despite these obstacles, there are glimmers of hope. In recent years, a broad, bipartisan consensus has begun to emerge in the United States that mass incarceration has been a costly failure. Both liberals and conservatives are increasingly recognizing the need for reform, albeit for different reasons. States like North Dakota have sent delegations to Norway to study their system and have begun to implement reforms inspired by the principles of normalization and dynamic security.
The Federal First Step Act, passed in 2018, was a modest but significant piece of legislation that introduced reforms to federal sentencing and expanded rehabilitation programs. These are small steps on a very long road, but they indicate a potential shift in the American consciousness. The conversation is slowly moving away from a singular focus on punishment and toward a more nuanced understanding of what it takes to build a truly safe and just society. Perhaps the most important lesson from Norway is not a specific architectural blueprint or a set of policies to be copied wholesale. It is the underlying belief that a society's decency can be judged by how it treats its most marginalized members, including those it has chosen to incarcerate. It is the courage to admit when a system is broken and the willingness to embark on a difficult, long-term process of transformation. The stark contrast between the American and Norwegian prison systems is not just a matter of policy. It is a reflection of two different visions of humanity. One sees the prisoner as an object to be controlled, a threat to be contained. The other sees the prisoner as a citizen in waiting, a person with the potential for change. One system is a dead end, a revolving door of despair. The other is a difficult but hopeful path toward restoration. Ultimately, the prison is a mirror. It reflects a society's deepest fears, its highest ideals, and its core values. In the cold, hard concrete of an American supermax, we see a reflection of a society that has chosen fear over hope and punishment over redemption. In the open, sunlit spaces of a Norwegian prison, we see the reflection of a society that has dared to believe in the possibility of a second chance. The question for America is, what kind of society does it want to see in its own reflection?